Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2, and today I'm incredibly excited to show you guys what is by far and away the best Arc Titan build in the game. With this build, you can do well over 1 million damage with just your melee attack, completely one-shotting really high health targets and even champions. Not only does our melee do a crazy amount of damage, but we can also get our abilities back incredibly quickly, allowing us to just spam our grenade and melee like crazy, while also buffing our gun damage, and even on top of that, there's also a ton of different ways that we can drastically increase our survivability as well for higher end content. This build is an absolute blast to play with, and no matter what season it is, this build will always be extremely strong. If you guys find the video helpful or you enjoy, please make sure to drop a like, as that would be greatly appreciated and it helps me out a ton. And feel free to check out my Hunter or Warlock builds, links will be in the description. Real quick before we get into the video, I want to give a big thanks to today's sponsor, which helps enable me to continue to create content for a living, and that sponsor is BLOODLINE Heroes of Lithis. BLOODLINE's Heroes of Lithis is a free-to-play card-based fantasy RPG game with realistic graphics, where you can not only collect champions, build kingdoms, but also create legendary heirs of your houses by combining forces of various bloodlines, such as orcs, lycans, demons, and dragonborn. You can further customize your champions by marrying different bloodlines until you find the perfect unique combination of powerful abilities and traits that suits your gameplay. You can create even stronger offspring by then marrying champions together and receiving new champions for free. There's an insane amount of champion combinations, and it's a ton of fun trying all of them out. BLOODLINE Heroes of Lithis is available for free on mobile for both Android and iOS, so if you're interested, make sure to download the game by using my link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. And if you use my gift code in the description, you'll get 1 champion token, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds, all for free. Make sure to check out the link in the description, and a huge thanks to BLOODLINE for sponsoring this video. So my goal with this build was to not only get my abilities back incredibly quickly so I could like spam my grenades, etc., but I mainly wanted to be able to do as much damage as humanly possible with a melee attack, so just for like general content I could run around one-shotting really high health enemies. As you can see in the gameplay, I'm actually using the Seismic Strike melee, which I'm able to hit for well over 1 million damage with when actually set up properly, which of course we'll get into the math on later and how we're actually able to achieve that. Both Thunderclap and Seismic Strike are very good melee options, but real quick I want to explain why I actually prefer Seismic Strike over Thunderclap. First off, if we just compare the base damage between these two with absolutely no buffs, the Seismic Strike does about 28,714 damage with an additional 10,442 damage added on top, giving it a total of 39,156 damage. A fully charged Thunderclap, on the other hand, does 56,384 damage, so obviously that's going to be more damage than Seismic Strike. However, for Thunderclap to actually do that much damage, you have to like sit there for that long and charge it up fully for a few seconds. Because of this charge time, you actually can't properly utilize a 1-2 punch shotgun with this melee unless you time it absolutely perfectly and you have it enhanced 1-2 punch shotgun, because 1-2 punch is only going to last 1.2 seconds normally. So if we were to factor in the additional 200% damage that you actually get from 1-2 punch, and use that with Seismic Strike instead, which you're able to pretty easily utilize. Seismic Strike now does 86,142 damage, plus an additional 31,325, for a total of 117,465, which is already more than double the damage of a fully charged Thunderclap. For this reason, I err to use the Seismic Strike melee instead of Thunderclap, but if you just don't want to use a 1-2 punch shotgun, or you're just like extremely good at timing the Thunderclap melee with an enhanced 1-2 punch shotgun, feel free to use Thunderclap instead. Personally, I just didn't find it nearly as consistent, and I didn't really enjoy the playstyle of having to charge it up. Also, very often my character would just lunge rather than charging it unless I was like super far away, which I found really annoying. And you also have other buffs with timers, such as Well of Ions and Knockout, which have very short timers, so it's much more difficult fitting a Thunderclap into that window when you factor in having to actually sit there and charging it. Ultimately, I just found Seismic Strike much more consistent, especially because you can just slide, shoot, and then shoulder charge, and always get the 1-2 punch with all the other buffs pretty easily. So now that we've got our melee of choice decided, let's talk about actually increasing how much damage we're going to do with our melee, and then we'll tie all of that into the rest of the build. The first and most obvious way to increase our melee damage is going to be through an exotic. Titan has about 3 options here, being Syntheseps, Wormgod Caress, and then Heart of Inmost Light. Each of them have their own use cases in certain scenarios. Generally, I prefer Syntheseps pretty much all the time, but let's talk about each of them. So, Syntheseps is pretty much going to give you a 200% additional melee damage increase pretty much all the time, as long as you're just surrounded by a couple of enemies. Ultimately, Syntheseps I think is the most consistent because you're just going to have incredibly high uptime on it, and it's just always going to give you a flat amount of huge extra melee damage, while Wormgod Caress rather gives you a total of 650% increased melee damage, which obviously is significantly much more damage, but it requires you actually getting 5 kills and the debuff or sorry, the buff only lasts for like 5 seconds, right? So it's much more difficult to actually fully take advantage of Worm God, but Worm God is ultimately going to give you the highest damage potential. In the clip where I hit for over 1 million, I am using Worm God Crest, but real quickly, here's a clip of me using Syntheseps to show you the maximum damage potential that you can achieve with using Syntheseps, which is still incredibly high. Lastly, we have Heart of Inmost Light. Heart of Inmost Light is not particularly good when it comes to actually buffing how much damage you're going to do with your melee or even your grenade. It's only like a 10 to 20% increase. However, it does give you a massive amount of ability regen. So if you're doing very low tier content like strikes or like normal lost sectors or something, and you just want your abilities back immediately, Heart of Inmost Light is absolutely perfect for that. Ultimately, if I were using this build on an everyday basis, I would just swap between Syntheseps and Heart of Inmost Light, most likely, depending on the content that I'm doing. Heart of Inmost Light just won't really be all that good for like higher tier content if you're trying to like one-shot champions or something, because you just won't get enough additional damage. So already, depending on our exotic, we'll either have 650% increased melee damage with Worm God, or we'll have 200% increase with Syntheseps. The next way that we can increase our melee damage is with a Well mod, Well of Ions. This is going to give you a 30% extra melee damage increase for your next hit after you pick up an Arc Elemental Well, which is just straight up 30% more. We've already talked about 1-2 Punch. 1-2 Punch obviously is going to give you 200% increased melee damage, so already we're at 200% plus 650% plus 30%. The last little bit of melee damage that we can get is through the Arc Aspect Knockout, which anytime that you defeat an enemy with your melee attack, it's going to give you a buff, which then gives you 60% additional melee damage. These are the only buffs that I was using in my clip to get over 1 million damage, but if you wanted to, you could additionally use Spark of Feedback. It's supposed to give you 75% additional melee damage after you get hit by a melee, but if you're using it in tandem with 1-2 Punch, it's only going to give you 55% additional melee. It gets reduced by 20%. However, actually fitting Spark of Feedback into this is incredibly hard to do, and I was not at all relying on Spark of Feedback to get that over 1 million damage number. So just to recap, we have an additional 60% via Knockout, 200% via 1-2 Punch, 650% with Worm God or 200% with Syntheseps, and an additional 30% with Well of Ions. The exact math on this is a little bit unclear for me. I don't want to give you guys misinformation, so for that reason, I'm just going to extrapolate from this clip here where I actually hit for under the damage cap. Because we're hitting for the damage cap, it's actually difficult for me to really gauge how much we're actually hitting for, and upon doing the math, it's difficult to tell which multipliers are actually additive versus multiplicative, and even when I've done the math 100 different ways, it doesn't entirely add up properly. So all that I know is that we're going to extrapolate from this clip where I hit for 807,000 and I was missing one buff. The one buff that I was missing was Well of Ions, which is a 30% multiplicative buff, which means that in this clip we are probably hitting for about 1,050,000 damage. Regardless, 1 million damage is 1 million damage no matter way you spin it. It's unclear to me whether or not I'm actually doing 1,050,000 or if I'm doing 1.2 million, which is another number that was calculated if everything is multiplicative, or significantly higher than that if I'm actually benefiting from both of the numbers scaling up at the same time. Regardless, we're doing absolutely insane amounts of damage. So now that we've figured out how to actually do as much melee damage as possible and how we can do well over 1 million pretty easily, now let's talk about how we can actually tie the rest of the build in and which fragments and stuff we want to use to get our abilities back extremely quickly. For the class ability, I'm using Thruster. If you're using Heart of Inmost Light, this is very nice. It really just speeds up the gameplay, not having to actually put down a barricade to benefit from that additional regen. Obviously, if you're doing higher end content, you could very easily use Rally or Towering Barricade. I'm just using it just for the mobility and just because it's nice to use, but you know, use whatever you want. Strafe Lift, best jump, no contest. Seismic Strike, Thunderclap, we've already talked about. Ballistic Slam just doesn't do very much damage, and I don't really like using it, so that's the reason that we're not using that. For the grenade, I really like to use Pulse Grenade because we're going to be using this in tandem with Touch of Thunder, where every time that our Pulse Grenade actually does damage, it's going to spawn an Ionic Trace, and an Ionic Trace is going to give us a whole bunch of ability energy, so this is particularly good. And Pulse Grenade is just a very high damage, really large radius grenade, and it's probably my favorite one to use. Alternatively, if you don't want to use Pulse Grenade, I think Storm Grenade is a pretty good option if you're using Heart of Inmost Light, because you don't really need all that energy regen if you're using Heart of Inmost Light. And Storm Grenade is really good because it'll actually run around and like track enemies, so it's really good overall for just really lower end content, but Storm Grenade isn't going to do as much damage as Pulse. We've already talked about Knockout, just going to give you a little bit of healing as well as just drastically increasing your melee damage, so that's really good. When it comes to the fragments, you actually have a few different options here. I'm going to go over 2 different ways you guys can set this up. First off, Spark of Resistance, I would pretty much have this all the time, just going to give you additional damage resistance while also giving you some strength stat, which is particularly nice, and ultimately this is very good. Spark of Shock is pretty much mandatory, I think. You could in some scenarios take it off, but ultimately it's just going to give your grenade a whole bunch of additional AoE potential because we're jolting, and then that jolt is going to spread and then kill everything. So I really like Spark of Shock. Spark of Amplitude is actually a survivability option. So we're using this paired with a boot mod, which of course we'll talk about later. So we're going to be constantly spawning orbs of power, and then we're actually going to be healing off of these orbs, as well as of course generating more super. Spark of Feedback we've kind of already talked about. I'm not entirely using it for the additional melee damage. Every once in a while, like circumstantially, you could benefit from this. It really depends on the content that you're doing. Ultimately, I like just having it for the ability to do additional damage, but you don't really need it all that much, especially with all the other stuff that we're stacking. I'm really just using it for the extra resilience. Of course, resilience right now doesn't actually work on Arc Titan, so the survivability is a little bit rough, but that'll end up getting fixed, of course, and then the resilience will be pretty good. And I think just having the option to do extra melee damage is pretty nice, as it is a pretty large multiplier. But Spark of Ions is a fantastic alternative, as anytime that you defeat a jolted target, it's actually going to create another ionic trace. So anytime that you throw your grenade, you're actually going to be spawning multiple ionic traces from using that fragment, and also from Touch of Thunder. And if you wanted to use like Storm Grenade instead of Pulse Grenade, you could certainly do that and then substitute a Spark of Ions to get your ionic trace. For the super, I prefer using Thunder Crash. I didn't have it on, but it doesn't really matter. Prefer to use whatever you want. For the artifact mods this season, I am currently using Lightning Strikes twice, which basically gives you 100 discipline whenever you have it activated, which is really nice. So we just get our grenade back incredibly quickly while building into our melee regeneration as well. So this is particularly good. Trace Evidence, I could be wrong. Recently I tested this on my Hunter. I haven't actually tested it on my Titan, and it did not work at all. If this does work, however, this is going to be very, very good, because every time that you melee an enemy with your Seismic Strike, it's actually going to blind them. So anytime that you get a kill with your Seismic Strike, you would then be spawning ionic traces, so that would be particularly good. So feel free to mess around with this if you don't really feel like you need the additional discipline and you don't need Lightning Strikes twice. Or if you just don't have as much space on your class item, you could feel free to definitely substitute with Trace of Evidence. I assume it will get fixed at some point. All right, now let's get into how we're actually going to be able to get our abilities back super quickly. So obviously, if you take a look at my stats, they're not great. My Titan's gear isn't particularly good. The thing that I wanted to prioritize was just having my melee up as much as possible, so I went for 100 strength. Obviously, if I was doing higher end content, I would try to get more resilience. Currently, resilience doesn't really work on Arc Titan, but like I said, this will probably get patched pretty soon. A lot of my gear is just from a long time ago where I have like recovery and stuff like that, but ultimately getting a mix of resilience plus strength would be very good, and we don't really need all that much discipline when we're using Lightning Strikes twice, or if you have enough ionic traces spawning, you get your grenade back very quickly, especially when you pair it with impact induction. Mobility, you don't really need, obviously. Recovery is nice for survivability, but ultimately I think resilience is better, and we also have some other ways of healing ourselves via some well mods, which we'll talk about. Getting into every individual mod. So first off, my helmet is Arc, so that I can get hands-on, so I gain bonus super energy on melee kills, which is very nice for just getting my super back very quickly. And then I have Harmonic Siphon, so anytime I kill an enemy with, you know, an arc weapon or something, I'm going to get some orbs, which is nice for getting my super back and just survivability. Obviously, you could swap this for an ammo finder if you felt like it. And then I have Elemental Ordnance, so I spawn wells with my grenade, so that really helps me get my grenade back and my melee back very quickly. For my gloves, I have Solar Gloves, so that I can get Bountiful Wells paired with Impact Induction. Impact Induction gives you a whole bunch of additional grenade energy whenever you hit enemies with your melee, and you can actually just spam your melee just punching to get a whole bunch of grenade energy back, so this is very, very good for just pretty much on demand getting your melee back. Of course, feel free to use a loader mod if you feel like it. I could very easily I could probably put on Focusing Strike, I guess. Doesn't really make all that much of a difference, or you could put on like a champion mod, depending on what you're doing. Then I have Bountiful Wells, literally just for additional energy. There's a whole bunch of other well mods, which I'll circle back on once we go over every piece that I'm using, but Bountiful Wells is just so that we spawn 2 wells every time that we do spawn a well, and this just gives us a whole bunch of ability energy, which is really nice. For the chest, I of course have Melee Wellmaker on, so that we spawn wells every time that we get kills with our melee, which actually worked with just the normal punch. You don't actually have to shoulder charge, so you can get your melee wells pretty much on cooldown, which is really nice. My chest is Void, so that I can get Thermoshock plating as well as Void resistance, or I could swap it for Concussive Dampener, etc. For the boots, you want to have Void boots because Better already gives you a ridiculous amount of survivability. I have 2 of them on. The second one doesn't really do all that much, so you could very easily swap this to Insulation or just, you know, Scavenger mod of your choice. And then I have Font of Might, which could be substituted with a whole bunch of different options. I just really like having the ability to do extra weapon damage every time that I pick up an Arc Elemental Well. This pairs very nicely with the build. You just do a whole bunch of extra damage with your gun, which I think just helps round out the build. Then lastly, on the cloak, I have Well of Ion, so I get the 30% extra melee damage, but this only does last for 1 melee punch, so if you find that you're having trouble fitting in a lot of the mods that you want, and you want to go for more survivability options, or you just want Well of Striking for even more regeneration, certainly you do not need Well of Ions, because Melee Wellmaker, or even your wells in general, have a cooldown, right? So you're not going to be able to have a Well of Ions permanently, but you can consistently have it for higher health targets. Then, like I said, I have lightning strikes twice, which you could very easily swap to the ionic trace one, or you could swap to like bad amplitude, surge detonators, whatever, depending upon what you're doing. And alternatively, if you want even more melee regeneration, you could put on like double outreach and just spam your thruster ability and get your melee back even faster. When it comes to other well mods, real quickly, I want to talk about a survivability option. So instead of bountiful wells or anything that gives you additional energy, something that I'd recommend is actually using explosive well maker. This is going to spawn a solar well, and it actually works with jolt, and it works with your melee. So you can spawn the solar wells pretty frequently, and if you pair this with well of life, you get an insane amount of health regeneration, which is really, really good for survivability. Alternatively, you could do the same thing with explosive well maker and then pair that with well of ordnance if you actually want to prioritize getting your grenade back rather than just your melee back. So that's pretty good. If you want to get your super back quickly, you could use Font of Wisdom just to give you additional intellect. And lastly, like I mentioned before, you could, instead of using like Elemental Ordnance or Font of Might, you could just put on another arc piece and use Well of Striking so that you get additional melee energy every time that you pick up an arc elemental well. Ultimately, how I have it set up with Elemental Ordnance, Bountiful Wells, Melee Wellmaker, Font of Might, and Well of Ions is generally what I prefer for most content, but I certainly would swap this around depending on if I'm doing higher end content or not. When it comes to the weapons, ultimately I think that this is highly preferential. I'm using a Wastelander, which you can actually craft with Enhanced 1-2 Punch now, which is particularly good. Slide Shot is also very nice on this, and it's very easy to take advantage of 1-2 Punch. But if you don't want to use 1-2 Punch, feel free to use literally anything that you want. Risk Runner I think is very, very good with the build, but honestly, if you want to use an Iclose SMG, you even don't even have to use an arc weapon, right? You could use any other type of weapon and just slap on, or sorry, just take off Font of Might and just substitute it for something else. The weapons are entirely up to you. I have a Cataclysmic on, which I didn't even mean to have on. Typically, I'd use a Hothead, or you could use like Thunderlord or something. Ultimately, the only thing that matters is really using a 1-2 Punch shotgun. In terms of how you want to play with the build, honestly, you can just run around, just spam your abilities. If you're trying to do as much damage as humanly possible to higher health targets, you want to make sure that you have the knockout buffs, meaning that you pretty much just recently killed an enemy with a melee. You want to make sure that you actually have Well of Ions for the 30% extra damage. And then you want to make sure that enemies are in close range if you're using Syntheseps or whatever. And if you want to actually be able to use 1-2 Punch with the Seismic Strike, you want to sprint for a little bit so you actually get the shoulder charge ready. You want to slide, and then while you're sliding, shoot, and then press your shoulder charge button, and then that will make it to where you have 1-2 Punch with your shoulder charge. Otherwise, you won't be able to take advantage of 1-2 Punch with your shoulder charge, and then 1-2 Punch would just be a dead mod, right? So then you could just swap to a different weapon and use Thunderclap instead if you felt like it. Hopefully the video helped. If it did, please be sure to drop a like, subscribe for videos similar to this one, and I will see you guys later. Peace.